Hello everyone, and welcome back once again to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and here on this beautiful rainy day when I am recording, I am sitting here with a cup of tea and a good book and some excellent company. So welcome to the second part of our journey through Real Grit by Silas Hocking. When we first met Jack Formby, who I have several times incorrectly referred to by a different name, a name from Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest, Jack Worthing, who is also a little bit of a cad and a reprobate now that I think of it. Maybe that's why there's an association there in my mind. But I digress. Jack Formby was a bit of a wastrel. He was not doing much with his life, and that seemed to be the way that his father wanted it. He was a man who spent a lot of time trying to build up his business, his fortune, and he didn't want his son to be worried about the same sorts of concerns that he was when he was young. And so he encouraged his son to take it easy, but that seems to have produced, if not an unforeseen effect, an unhoped for effect, in that Jack is now just completely apathetic towards life in general. Or rather he was, until he met an enchanting young woman, a mysterious young woman, on a walk one day. He became consumed with thoughts of seeing her again, and in fact, we saw last episode that he did. Jack met her once again at a tennis party thrown by one of his friends, and discovered that her name was Miss Ada Woodville. And that is where we left the story. Jack now knows Miss Woodville, and we will see what effect she has on our young wastrel. So let us continue from where we left off with Chapter 4 of Silas Hocking's Real Grit, Something to Live For. At last, Jack Formby had found something to live, something in life to interest him, and to render existence less a bore. The dawn of a great, strong love was beginning to touch his drowsy, indifferent nature, and to thrill it into life and animation. For many days and weeks he was a sore puzzle to himself. He was conscious in his own hazy way that a change had come over his spirits and over his life. The flowers, always beautiful in his eyes, had somehow grown more beautiful, and the song of the birds had a sweeter cadence than ever he had known before. The green of the wind-swept hills had changed to a richer hue, and the purple moors were more glorious than he had ever seen them in the days gone by. Even the Bodle rippled over its stony bed with a more joyous song, while the lowing of cattle in the distant fields seemed to have possibilities of music and melody in it. He discovered, too, that girls were not at all bad when one got to know them, and that a game of tennis, to say the least of it, was splendid exercise. Garden parties he had pronounced to be rare fun, and never declined an invitation to one if he could possibly help it. Yet for many weeks he never questioned himself as to the secret of this change, while the thought of being in love scarcely occurred to him. He had never been of the sentimental sort, and had never been given to reading novels, while the idea of marriage had scarcely entered his head. During those weeks he met Ada Woodville continually, and thought her more beautiful every time he saw her. She was like a beautiful picture, or a beautiful piece of statuary, so he said to himself, that he was never tired of looking at, and whose beauty grew upon him the more he looked at it. Yet he never thought of being in love with her, any more than of being in love with a picture. It is true she possessed many charms that a picture could never possess. To begin with, she could talk to him, and when she did so, her voice in his ears was sweeter than any music that he had ever heard, and thrilled his heart in a way that he could not understand, while the expression of her face was constantly changing, and her eyes revealed depths of tenderness and sympathy that no canvas could shadow forth. Could all this mean love? In truth, he never thought of asking himself the question. He enjoyed the days as they came and went, revelled in the mild intoxication of her presence, yet never asked its meaning or questioned to what it tended. Meeting her one morning in the little village of Esbrig, that stands at the confluence of the S and the Bodle, he suddenly discovered that he was going in her direction, and so they walked away together, and soon found themselves out in the country, with their faces toward the moors. How her presence thrilled him as she walked by his side! How deliciously sweet was the morning air! How gladsome and joyous the singing of the birds! Jack felt as if he did not want to talk. He would just like to walk quietly on forever, with Ada Woodville at his side, and revel in the quiet and in the beauty. At first, they talked about the weather and the latest garden party, and then silence fell between them, and they walked on slowly for half a mile, as though each were unconscious of the other's presence. Pausing at length and lifting her eyes upwards towards the moors, Ada said, as if speaking to herself, "Your country is very beautiful, where the smoke has not spoiled it, but it is not equal to our sunny south." "I was not aware you were a southerner," Jack said, looking at her steadily. "Oh, yes, I am," she said with a little laugh, "unless you would call me a westerner. The truth is, I am what your Lancashire operatives call a Cornwaller." "Indeed?" he said, in a tone of surprise, but she went on without heeding him. "I dare say I am prejudiced in favour of my native country, but it seems to me the most beautiful of all the places I have seen. And and then so many happy memories gather about the old home where I was born, and where I lived all my life till I came here. Alas, it is my home no longer." "Your home no longer?" said Jack inquiringly. And then he regretted that he had spoken, for he saw that her eyes were full of tears, and her lips trembling with emotion. "My Uncle Netherby wanted me to leave it last Christmas, when my mother died," she went on at length, "but I could not tear myself away, especially as dear old Nurse would be without a home. But when Nurse died a month ago, I felt that every tie was broken, and that I could not stay there any longer." "And is your father dead also?" Jack asked at length. "Oh, yes," was the quick reply. "He died 5 years ago. If he were living, all would be well." Perhaps all is well as it is," Jack ventured to remark. "Yes, I try to think so," she replied, "though it is very hard to realize sometimes that all things are working together for good." "Yes, I suppose it is," he said, slowly, as if debating the question with himself. "When my mother died," she went on, "I felt as if all the world were dark, that life had nothing more to offer, and I prayed that I might die too." "You should not talk of dying," he said. "You are too young and too—" He had nearly added beautiful, but checked himself in time. "God has helped me to bear my grief," she said, "and I am very happy here. Uncle and Aunt Netherby are just as kind as they can be, and Dick and Kate are just as good as if they were my brother and sister." "Oh, yes, you could not have fallen into better hands," he remarked after a pause. "No, I am sure I could not," she answered quietly and with emphasis. "And then, besides that, I am getting to know such a number of nice people." "Yes, there is very good society in this neighbourhood," he answered, "and you're sure to make friends." "Do you think so?" she asked with a smile. "I'm certain of it," he said emphatically. "I only wish I had a sister or mother that you could visit at our house." "I wish you had," she said ingenuously. "I'm sure it must be very lonely for you. Why don't you go into business with your father?" "He doesn't want me," said Jack lugubriously. "Besides, I have no talent in that direction." "Indeed?" she said. "And what do you intend to be?" "Oh, nothing, I suppose," he answered, beginning to feel very uncomfortable. "My father is anxious that I should take life easy and enjoy myself." "And do nothing for the good or enjoyment of others?" she asked. "That question has not been considered, I fear," he said, with growing uneasiness. "But you surely will not live for yourself only," she said, looking at him seriously. "That is not like you, I'm sure. You'll find some great purpose in life yet, and we shall hear of your achievements." He blushed uncomfortably under her steady gaze, and heartily wished that he could turn the conversation into some other channel. But there seemed no help for it, so he blurted out in his dogged way, "The only purpose in life, for me, it seems, is to squeeze all the juice I can out of the orange." "Oh, no," she said. "I'm sure that's not like you, for you're not a bit selfish." "You do not know me," he said, "for I am not only selfish, but I am idle and altogether lacking in enterprise. In truth, I have no purpose in life, and very little ambition. Unfortunately, I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth, and it has been kept there ever since. I wish I were other than I am, that's a fact, for I don't want to add hypocrisy to my other vices." "Oh, Mr. Formby," she said with a laugh, "what a long and cruel speech. You surely would not have me believe or think so ill of you as all that?" "I would have you think as well of me as you honestly can," he said seriously, "but I am afraid none of my friends can think very well of me." "You should take a lesson from your relative, Mr. Ralph," she said banteringly. "How full of energy and enthusiasm he is, how anxious to do good and serve his generation. I do think him a splendid type of Englishman." To this, Jack made no reply. He did not like to tell his companion that she was utterly unable to read character, and was unused to the ways of worldly and designing men. Moreover, Ralph Formby was a distant relative of his, and he shrank from saying a word that might be considered to reflect upon his character. And yet he felt that this guileless child of nature, coming from her far-away country home, should be put upon her guard, and screened from the perils that would beset her in this new sphere of life. He knew that he was not the right person to do this, though he would gladly give his life to protect her. He was not her guardian, but he might be her friend, and more than that, he would be. He would not needlessly obtrude himself, but he could watch over her, notwithstanding, and she need never know anything about it. A few minutes ago, he said he had no purpose in life, but now he had suddenly discovered one. Ralph Formby meant no good in trying to ingratiate himself into the favour of this pure maiden, and yet the Netherbys would encourage him, he was sure, for he had so wormed his way into their good graces that they regarded him as a paragon of excellence. What should he do, then, in the matter? Should he remain silent, or should he put her on her guard? "In truth, I must be silent," he said to himself. "I know nothing positive against Ralph. He may be all he professes to be. I have no great love for him, it's true, and no great faith in him, but that proves nothing. I have a feeling that he is not a good man, that behind all his fine ways he hides, well, to put it mildly, an ungenerous heart. But then I may be wrong in my surmises. No, I must remain silent, but I must watch, nevertheless." He had just come to this conclusion when Ada interrupted his reflections by saying, "You do not much care for your cousin, I think, Mr. Formby." "What makes you think that?" he said, with a start and a blush. Well, I hardly know, she answered in some slight confusion. But I thought so the first time you came to play tennis. And now, when I praise him, you do not speak. Ralph is but a distant relative of ours, he said, and we have never been on very intimate terms. Hence I do not know what his virtues are, and so cannot speak positively on the matter. Oh, that is mere evasion, she said laughingly, and I shall do my best to get you to be the very, very best of friends, and to love each other as cousins should. It's very kind of you, I'm sure, he answered, but you must not make the mistake of supposing that we are not friends. I can assure you of no word of strife ever having passed between us. Oh, I didn't suppose that, she said with another laugh. But suppose we change the subject. Here we are on the fringe of the moors. I have often wanted to come as far as this. The view from here is very fine, don't you think so? He asked, feeling relieved at the turn in the conversation. Yes, she said hesitatingly, but I miss the sea. I have a feeling that it ought to be yonder, just as we see it shining across the downs at home. But you will soon get to love the heather, he said. I think those rolling billows of purple and brown are very fine. And listen to the dreamy music the wind is making. And see how the sunshine glints on the pools here and there. I hardly think your Cornwall can beat this. You have not seen Cornwall, I think, she said. Well, no, I've not, he answered. The truth is, it is such an out-of-the-way place that the trouble of getting there has always struck me as being too big a price to pay for anything it might have to offer in the shape of scenery. You will not say so after you have been there, she replied. Though, please, do not think I don't admire this, for I think it is just delicious. I'm glad you think so, he answered, for it wouldn't do to have you always fretting about the county you have left and longing to get back again. Oh, but I have not left it altogether, she said with a smile. I expect to spend at least 3 months every year amongst my Cornish friends and kindred. I should pine myself to death if I thought I could go back no more. But come, it's time we turned our faces in the other direction, or I will be late for lunch. And you too, I expect. I lunch at any time when it is most convenient, he answered. But I am at your service, Miss Woodville. The walk back was accomplished in much less time, for the way was downhill most of the distance. You must be tired, he said, just before they reached the gate of Netherby Hall. I'm afraid I've been inconsiderate. Oh no, I'm not in the least tired, she answered brightly. I could easily walk as far again. Uncle is always pressing me to take more horse exercise, but I prefer walking to riding. We might take a canter to Whetstone Edge some morning, if you could prevail on your cousins to come with us. Is it too far to walk? She asked. Oh, yes, very much too far. But I will speak to your cousin about it. Thank you, she said, but here we are at the gate. And she placed her little hand in his with a smile and a soft Good morning. The rest of the way home Jack accomplished like one in a dream, and when after lunch he sat, smoking his cigar under the veranda, he was more than half disposed to believe that he had dreamed it all. Chapter 5. Lost on the Moors. The walk and talk recorded in the last chapter were but the prelude to many similar rambles, so that by the time Ada Woodville had been 3 months at Netherby Hall, she knew all the countryside almost as well as the natives. She got to be passionately fond of the moors, and often took long rambles alone, much to the discomfort of her cousin Kate, who considered it a very improper thing to do. But Ada could not see where the impropriety came in, if she had been allowed by her mother to ramble alone over the Cornish downs. She did not see why she might not be allowed to rove across the Lancashire moors, and told her cousin so. "But my dear Ada," said stately Miss Netherby, "you never know who you may meet, and besides, the moors are lonely and dangerous in places." "Oh, I already know where the dangerous places are," Ada responded readily. "And as for loneliness, I just revel in it. The wind whisking and soughing across the heather makes music just like the sea sometimes, and I just sit still and listen and dream of home. Oh, you can't tell how much I enjoy it. I think I should like to live on the moors. And then I know all the keepers now, so that I am never likely to meet anyone I don't know in a place that is so strictly preserved." "You're a strange child, Ada," responded Kate in a patronising tone. "I wish you would get a little more into society ways." "Oh, but I don't care, you know, for what you call society. I'm just a simple country maiden, and nothing more. And in truth, I don't want to be." "But you should want to be, Ada," said Kate severely. "You know how you rave against men having no lofty ideal and being fired by no great ambition and all that kind of a thing. Why don't you have a lofty ideal yourself?" I have, Cousin Kate," Ada answered with a downcast eye and a tremor in her voice. "But it is not to be what you would have me be. But please, let us change the subject, and don't get angry with me for loving the hills and moors." "Angry, child? No, I am not angry with you," said Kate, kissing her forehead. "But I want my little cousin to be careful, and not needlessly rush into danger." "I will not do that," said Ada brightly, and there the conversation ended. But the rambles continued as before, for the autumn time revealed fresh beauties on moor and hill, and tempted Ada forth at all hours of the day, and filled her with the most exquisite pleasure. Jack Formby was always on the lookout for that dainty figure that he could recognise a mile away, and so he dropped upon her at the most unexpected times, and suddenly crossed her path when she had no suspicion he was near. Yet to her their meeting seemed the most natural thing in the world. He was as fond of the moors and hills as she was, and it would be strange indeed if, rambling about so much, they did not cross each other's path now and then. In her innocence and simplicity she had no suspicion that this handsome young fellow was constantly on the lookout for her, and took his rambles not so much for love of nature as for love of her. When she saw him striding along the hillside, she would say to herself, "There's Mr. Formby out for one of his constitutionals again. I wonder if he will come this way. How fond he is of nature." And if Jack should happen to turn in another direction, as was sometimes the case, she was conscious of a pang of disappointment, and the ramble would lose a good deal of its pleasure and charm. But the wily fellow generally recognized her, though he might make no sign to that effect, and an hour later or less would suddenly and unexpectedly drop across her path, and then lift his eyes as though surprised at meeting her. At such times she always welcomed him with a smile, and sometimes told him that she was so glad to meet him, and he would treasure up her words in his heart, and ponder them over in the quiet of the afternoon, when sitting alone at home. So the days slipped quickly and pleasantly away, while Ada and Jack began to feel as though they had known each other all their lives. He told her all about himself, all about his school and college days, and how he always failed in his exams, and how he never had, and feared he would never have, any heart or soul for work. And she would chide him as a sister might, and read him pretty lectures on what she thought young men ought to do. She had a very high and beautiful ideal of life and duty, and she tried to inspire her companion with the thoughts that had burned their way into her own heart and brain. And he would listen, very patiently, and with evident interest, for he loved to hear her talk, and on the whole she talked well and to the point, but he rarely gave her to feel that her talk had done him good. "If I had your head and heart and enthusiasm," he would sometimes say, "I might do something. But really, Miss Woodville, there is nothing for a fellow in my position to do, and you know it is too much trouble to go hunting up work when there is no absolute necessity for it." And she would sigh, and look pained, and sometimes drop the conversation altogether. At other times he would lead her on to talk of herself and her early home, and then she would be at her best. So graphic were her word pictures sometimes that Jack, though not of the imaginative sort, could see Trevenna House, with the little village from which it took its name lying below it in the pleasant green valley, and the quaint square tower of the old church almost hidden among the trees. Could see the shimmer of the distant sea, where the valley broadened out, and the wooded hills rising right and left, and beyond these again he could see the breezy downs, where the golden gorse bloomed through all the summer, and the bracken lay like heaps of gold in the autumn time, and onward still the bold and rocky promontories that pushed themselves far out into the sea, and even the white sail in the offing of some coaster or fishing smack, tacking before the breeze. "You fairly make me want to see this wonderful county of yours," he would sometimes say, after she had been describing some favourite scene. "I think I shall take a rambling tour in that direction if I live to see another summer." And she would answer, quickly, "I wish you would," and then, more slowly, "But it might not seem all to you that it does to me. It's my home, you know." Towards the end of October, the weather took a sudden change, and the brilliantly fine weather that had obtained for many weeks gave place to rain and drizzle and fog. All the glory of the woods and hills vanished as if by magic, and outdoor exercise became almost an impossibility. This continued till the middle of November, when the skies began to brighten a little, and the short, dull days had occasioned gleams of pale, watery sunshine. But the weather, at best, was very treacherous, and though the morning might be as bright as a November morning can be, there was no certainty that it would not give place to a regular downpour before noon. Ada sat in her room and watched the lowering skies with feelings of dismay, almost of despair. She never imagined that being confined to the house would become so irksome, and as the days passed on, she fairly pined for the breezy upland and the fresh, bracing air of the moors. She missed, too, the cheerful presence of Jack Formby. Debate the question with herself as she might, that was a fact she could not deny. So at last she gave in. "Of course I miss him," she said to herself. "I should be a very strange creature if I did not. He's been very kind to me, and never obtrusive, and though he is by no means my ideal, he ought to be ashamed of his indolent ways, yet he has some very good qualities, and I like him, as a friend, very much." This conclusion seemed to her eminently satisfactory, and a sufficient reason why she should continue to think about him and wish for his presence. Jack would have found the weather more irksome than Ada, but for the fact that his father, having some business in London that would take him a week or two to complete, took him with him, and in the metropolis he found plenty of things to occupy his attention and fill up his days and nights. The visit proved a much longer one than was at first anticipated, and it was not until the 2nd of December that they started for home. For a week the weather had been dry and cold, so that the roads were once more in fair walking condition, a fact that Ada Woodville was not slow in taking advantage of. Naturally, Jack had thought a good deal about her while he had been away, but not so much as he would have done had he been at home. On his return, however, all the old love and longing came back, and he was all impatience to see her face once more. On the following evening, therefore, he made his way towards Netherby Hall, ostensibly to see Dick, really to see Ada. The day had been warm and bright, but towards the middle of the afternoon a thick fog had come on, with almost unexampled suddenness, shutting out every glimpse of the surrounding country, and rendering locomotion in the narrow country lanes anything but pleasant. "I do hate these fogs," Jack said to himself as he peered cautiously ahead. "They are so fearfully bewildering. God help the folks crossing the moors on an evening like this." For himself, he had no fear. The way to Netherby Hall was definite enough, and he could not possibly get lost, unless he deliberately climbed over the hedge, which he had no intention of doing. At Netherby Hall he received a hearty and unmistakable welcome, and found the genial warmth of the bright, if somewhat gaudy, drawing-room most grateful after the oppressive gloom outside. All the members of the family were present, except Ada Woodville, and when at length Jack ventured to inquire after her, Kate informed him, in her stately way, that the child was in her own room, and was doubtless hugging her knees in the firelight, contentedly dreaming. "A very pleasant occupation," Jack suggested, "especially on such a dismal evening." And then the conversation drifted to general topics, till Jack had an opportunity of speaking alone to Dick on some trivial matter that served as an excuse for his calling. Kate, meanwhile, left the room, but was not absent more than 5 minutes, when she returned with a white, scared face, and startled everyone present by announcing that Ada was not in her room, and that one of the maids had informed her that Miss Woodville went out early in the afternoon, and had not returned. "Are you sure she has not returned?" said Mrs. Netherby, starting from her chair. "You should not frighten us with such tidings unless you are quite certain. Go to her bedroom, and, if needs be, search every room in the house." The search proved unavailing, as everyone feared it would. Jack waited, with his elbow on the mantelpiece, in a perfect agony of fear. But no sooner was it known that she had not returned from her walk than he rushed out of the house without speaking to anyone, hurried to the stables where he secured a lantern and a strong stick, and then made straight for the moors. He knew every step of the way, knew her favourite walks on the moors, and knew, too, where the dangerous places lay. Fortunately, though the night was intensely dark, the fog had lifted somewhat, or his lantern would have been of little use. He neither saw nor felt the road that night. He ran on like one in a dream, and was possessed of the strength of a giant. One agonizing thought absorbed his whole being. Ada Woodville was lost on the moors. She was dying, perhaps, or dead, and he must find her. Living or dead, he must find her. And with this thought burning into his very brain, he ran on and on, utterly unconscious of weariness or fatigue. He was conscious when he reached the fringe of the moors, though he never paused. A tall stile he cleared with a bound, and then, like a bloodhound on a certain trail, he pushed forward still. A narrow path between banks of heather lay, straight as a rule, before him for a quarter of a mile. Then the path divided, and from these other paths branched out in all directions. Here, doubtless, in the fog she had got bewildered. From this point she had wandered away, but in what direction? Far away into the black night stretched miles of bewildering heather and bog, and she, perhaps, was wandering hopelessly on and on, crying like a startled child in the night for help that never came. Or, worse still, perhaps, was lying exhausted or dead on those treacherous and desolate wilds. Here, at the parting of the ways, Jack paused, and with his lantern held low, searched carefully for footsteps in the boggy soil. But he could discover no mark that helped him in his search. "Heaven help her, and me," he said, drawing himself up to his full height, and in that agonizing moment his awakening was completed. He knew now that he loved her with all the strength of his heart and soul. The secret of the change that had come over him was clear as day. Ada Woodville was dearer to him than his life, and without her, life would be a burden and a blank. And yet here I stand like a block of wood, he said to himself, while she perhaps is perishing. Then, raising his voice to its highest pitch, he called, "Ada! Ada! Ada!" But no answer came out of the darkness, but the swish of the wind in the heather, or the flutter of the night bird's wing, startled from its nest. If she has strayed into Boggart Clough, she will not hear me, though I call all night. I must go and search. And suiting the action to the word, he started forward once more. He had to be cautious, for the way was boggy and uncertain, and the light from his lantern scarcely penetrated a yard before him. At length, after what seemed to him an interminable period, he reached the brink of the Clough, a deep gully that had been fretted away by the action of water. The sides were steep and uncertain, the edge ragged and treacherous, while the gully was being continually widened by landslips, which broke away at any moment, and in the most unexpected places. Along the edge of this clough Jack crept cautiously, with his head bent low, and his lantern almost touching the ground. He knew the dangerous character of the soil, knew that the ground might slip from beneath his feet at any moment, but he was not to be deterred. Though certain destruction awaited him, he would still go on. At length he paused, while a startled expression swept over his face. Was that a moan he heard? He lifted up his head and listened. The night wind was still whistling through the heather, and far down the clough was the faint gurgle of falling water. Perhaps the Boggarts were coming out, for they held carnival on such a night as this, he had heard. But hist! That was surely a cry of some kind. "Ada!" he called, bending over the dark edge of the clough, and he held up his finger in a listening attitude. "Help! Oh, help!" came in faint accents from the dark gulf below. "I'm coming, my darling," he called, and the next moment he had slipped over the edge of the clough and was sliding swiftly down its slimy banks to the bottom. Fortunately, the side was not so steep but that he could control himself easily, and when he reached the bottom he was little the worse for the adventure. Here he paused, and called again, "Ada, where are you?" But a low moan, almost close to him, was the only answer. Instantly he sprang forward in the direction from whence the sound came, and soon discovered the object of his search, half hidden in a pool of water, and utterly powerless to raise herself. Dropping his lantern and stick, Jack stooped and caught her up in his strong arms, and without asking a single question prepared to climb with her the slippery bank of the clough. This he found to be utterly impossible, and with a groan of despair he sat down on a boulder with the still, unconscious form of Ada Woodville in his arms. "I fear I cannot get you out of this place, Miss Woodville," he said at length, for somehow he shrank from calling her Ada now. It might seem as though he were taking advantage of her helplessness. But she made no reply to his remark. "Do you not hear me? he said, bending his face close to hers. But the pale lips did not move. She lay in his arms as though she were dead. "Heaven help us," he muttered, and he gazed round him in the darkness as though in mute appeal for help. His lantern had gone out, and the night was as dark as ever. No sound broke the stillness save the rush of rippling water in the Clos, and the soft rush of the night wind high above his head. "If she were able to walk ever so little," he said to himself, "it might be managed. But if she continues in this state, we shall both of us be dead by morning." A moment later, Ada gave a little shudder, and then a low moan escaped her lips. "Thank heaven she's coming to," Jack murmured, and pressed her closer to his breast. "Oh, where am I?" she called at length. "Who are you, and what is this place?" "Don't alarm yourself, Miss Woodville," Jack answered tenderly. "You got lost on the moors. Don't you remember?" "Oh, yes, I know," she said. I got lost in the fog and fell into the Clos. Oh, please, get me out, Mr. Formby. They will be so anxious at home." "Do you think you can walk at all?" he said, "for I have tried to carry you up the slippery slope and failed." "Oh, I do not know," she said, "but I will try. I will do anything to get out of this place. It was wrong of me to come alone on the moors." "Don't blame yourself," he said. "You could not help the fog coming on. I hope you're not hurt." "I do not know," she said. "I feel so strange and weak. I got frightened in this horrible place. Oh, you were good, Mr. Formby, to come to my rescue." Don't talk about that now, please," said Jack. "But try and stand by yourself. Does it pain you?" "Oh, no, I think I can walk a little." "Try your very best," he said cheerfully, "and I think we will manage yet." How they reached the top he never knew. It was a life-and-death struggle, and but for the energy born of the great love he bore Ada Woodville, he would have given up in despair. She had little strength left for the struggle, though she was wonderfully brave and hopeful. Holding fast with their nails, they fought their way up inch by inch, and when at length they reached the top, Jack raised a great cry, "Help! Help!" And 5 minutes later, Dick Netherby and several keepers came upon the scene, and found them both unconscious. And it is in that state that we will leave Ada and Jack today. But we will return soon to find out what becomes of Mr. Formby in the following chapters, and what this revelation as to his feelings for Miss Woodville mean for both their futures.